The Catton Forest Massacre was a war crime committed by the Soviet NKVD in April and May of 1940, in which they executed 15,000 Polish officers that were being held in 3 camps, known as Kozielsk, Ostashkov, and Starobjesk. A further 6,000 Poles who were held in prisons across Soviet-occupied eastern Poland were also murdered at the same time. In April 1943, the Nazis announced their discovery of a mass grave in the Katyn forest, with 4,000 bodies of the officers from the Kozielsk camp. The name Katyn has come to refer and symbolize the mass murder of the Poles at the different locations in the spring of 1940, even though the other execution sites were still unknown at that time. While the Nazis claimed the Soviets were responsible for the mass murder, the Soviets denied responsibility and claimed that the Nazis had done it. No one who was familiar with the story, the timelines, and the known facts believed the Soviets. 50 years after the murder, in 1990, the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev admitted that the murders were committed by the Soviets. This video is a review of some of the English literature and books available about the Catton Forest Massacre. Those books written before the 1990 Soviet admission of guilt were correct in their conclusions about Soviet responsibility. The books published after that date could make reference to the Soviet confession and the documentation that became available. Józef Mackiewicz was a Polish writer, novelist, and political commentator. Mackiewicz was among the group of Poles that the Germans brought to the site of the Catton Massacre in the spring of 1943. He later worked for the Anders Army, where he edited a compilation of documents related to the Catton Massacre, which was published in 1948. At the same time, he wrote his own book under the title Katyn, Zbrodnia bez sądu I kary, Katyn, Murder Without Trial Nor Sentence. This first Polish-language publication was apparently destroyed by the publisher in London for political reasons. In 1951, he published the English version of this book under the title The Cattonwood Murders, the very first book in English on the subject. In 1952, he testified before the U.S. Senate committee which was investigating the Catton Massacre. Between 1951 and 1952, a U.S. congressional committee, chaired by Ray Madden of Indiana, investigated the Catton Forest Massacre. Their study constituted the most comprehensive examination of the matter ever undertaken, with 103 witnesses, 183 exhibits, 200 depositions, and hearings in Washington, D.C., Chicago, London, Frankfurt, Berlin, and Naples. The committee's published work consisted of 7 volumes totaling 2,679 pages. The 8th and final, not numbered, volume is the report of the House Select Committee to conduct an investigation of the facts, evidence, and circumstances of the Catton Forest Massacre of the 82nd Congress. It is dated December 22nd, 1952. The principal conclusion of the committee was unanimous. The Soviets were guilty of murdering the Polish officers, and their deaths could not have occurred later than 1940. In other words, before Nazi Germany attacked the USSR. The committee recommended that the House refer the case to the UN and request a trial before the International Court of Justice. John Lauck was an officer in the U.S. Marine Corps who served in World War II and a business professor at an American university. His 1988 book, Katyn Killings in the Record, provides, in the first part, a review of the history of the Catton Massacre and how it was dealt with at Yalta and Nuremberg. In the second part, he provides an overview and a summary of the witness hearings of the U.S. Congressional Committee. If you don't have access or time to read the 7 volumes and 2,679 pages of the committee's hearings, then this work is a good summary. Janusz Kazimierz Zawodny was a Polish-American historian, political scientist, and World War II soldier and resistance fighter of the Polish underground. His 1962 book, Death in the Forest, the study of the Catton Forest Massacre, was considered for years to be a leading study in the matter based on the information that was known at that time. The book attempts to reconstruct in detail the fate of the prisoners and to provide answers to these questions. Who killed these Polish officers? How were they killed? And why were they killed? As a result of several years of work carried out by a team of Poles working under one editor, the first version of this book, The Crime of Katyn, Facts and Documents, was published in the Polish language in London in 1948. An English version was simultaneously prepared with the Polish one, but was not published until 1965. This book consists of a compilation of documents and evidence whose aim is to give a true account of the Catton Massacre. Given the failure at Nuremberg to prosecute the real perpetrators of this war crime, it was hoped that this book would appeal to the conscience of the world and international justice. Louis Fitzgibbon was born in London and entered the Naval College at Dartmouth in 1938. He served in the British Navy from 1942 until 1954. He later studied law, ran his own business, was a personal assistant to a member of Parliament, an executive with a commercial company in London, and also served as the director of a trade association and 2 national charities. Fitzgibbon was active for years in publicizing the suppressed truth about the Catton Massacre. During the 1970s, he wrote a number of books bringing forth the contemporary accumulated evidence and presenting some of the most graphic and compelling evidence of Soviet guilt. His books included Katyn, The Cover-Up, A Crime Without Parallel, The Triumph of Evil, Unpitied and Unknown, and more recently in the 1980s, the paperback The Catton Massacre. From 1971 until 1977, he was secretary of the Catton Memorial Fund and served as chairman of the Catton Memorial Committee in London, which organized the erection of a monument in London honoring the victims of Catyn in 1976. He also wrote another book about that experience called Catton Memorial. This is the Crime Without Parallel book. Stanisław Świaniewicz was a Polish economist, a historian, and veteran of the Polish Bolshevik War of 1919-1920. On August 2nd, 1939, he was mobilized in the Polish army as a reserve officer. After the Soviet invasion of Poland, his unit attempted to reach the Hungarian or Romanian borders in order to find its way to France, where the Polish army was being recreated. However, he was captured by the Soviets and became a prisoner of war. He was interned at Kozielsk together with thousands of other Polish officers. During the period of the Katyn murders in the spring of 1940, he was attached one day to a group of Polish officers being moved by train to a small station in Gniezdowo, near Katyn. While his fellow officers were being transferred in small groups from the train to a blacked-out bus so that they could be transported to the execution site, Świaniewicz was taken aside by a senior officer and was able to watch the procession, not knowing that he had just been saved from death. He was then transferred to Moscow, where he was held in the Lubyanka and Butyrki prisons. After roughly a year of interrogation, his pre-war books on economics were interpreted as espionage, for which he was sentenced to 8 years in the Gulag. He was released from the prison camps after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union and eventually managed to join the Anders army. He remained in the Polish embassy in Moscow as one of the officials entrusted with searching for the missing Polish officers. He then left Russia and reached Great Britain, where he remained active in the Polish government in exile. He was also co-author of The Crime of Catyn Facts and Documents, one of the first monographs of mass murder of the Polish officers by the Soviets, which was published in Polish in 1948. After the war, he remained in London and started giving lectures at numerous universities around the world, including some in the USA, Indonesia, and Canada. Since his family was still in Stalinist Poland during the hearings before the U.S. Congressional Committee, he testified in a mask under a false name. Świaniewicz's son, Witold Świaniewicz, was the editor of the first edition of his father's W cieniu Katynia, which was published in Polish in 1976. Witold also translated the book into English and published this under the title In the Shadow of Katyn, Stalin's Terror, in 2002. Joseph Chapski was a Polish artist, author, and critic, as well as an officer in the Polish army. Following the start of the Nazi and Soviet attack on Poland, he was made a prisoner of war by the Soviets and held at Starobjesk. He was among the 395 Polish officers at the three camps who were not murdered in the Catton Massacre, but were instead taken to Gryazowiec. After the 1941 German invasion of the Soviet Union, Chapski was released and joined the Anders army. Between 1941 and 1942, Chapski was tasked with investigating the disappearance of Poles who had been in the captivity of the NKVD and subsequently massacred. He never received any satisfactory answers as to the fate of these men, but he wrote about his experiences in two books, Reminiscences of Starobjesk, 1944, and The Inhuman Land, 1949. This copy of his Memoirs of Starobjesk is in French. The Inhuman Land is the only work of Chapski's that was translated into English and was published in London in 1951. It is a first-hand account of contemporaneous negotiations with the Soviets over the missing Polish officers, and as such is an important document. In the post-war period, Chapski was also among the eyewitnesses of the situation of the Polish prisoners in Soviet captivity and testified on the matter before the United States Congressional Committee. After World War II, he remained in Paris, where he was among the founders of Kultura Monthly, one of the most influential Polish cultural journals of the 20th century. Tadeusz Witlin attended the University of Warsaw, earning separate master's degrees in law in 1932 and the arts in 1933. Soon he gave up the practice of law in favor of a position as an editor of a satirical magazine. By then he had already published a volume of poetry and a novel. When World War II began in 1939, he joined the Polish Armed Forces and soon found himself in Russian captivity. He was released after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union and traveled across Russia to join the Anders army. During his service with the army, he was a public relations officer and an editor of a news magazine published for the Polish armed forces. After the war, he briefly worked in Paris before emigrating to the United States, where initially he was a translator and writer for Radio Free Europe and Voice of America. In 1959, he became the editor of the United States Information Agency's Polish-language publication, America. Tadeusz Witlin published 16 books that included a set of sketches about his time in Russia entitled A Reluctant Traveler in Russia, published in 1952, Time Stopped at 6:30, about Katyn, published in 1965, and Commissar, The Life and Death of Lavrenti Pavlovich Beria, in 1972. The title of the book about Katyn is taken from the last line that was found in a diary written by one of the victims found at the Katyn forest. Dr. Salomon Sloes was a Jewish medical officer in the Polish army in 1939. He was taken prisoner by the Soviets. He was held at Kozielsk and was one of the 395 officers taken from the three camps to Gryazowiec and thus avoided being a victim of the Catton Massacre. For years, he has been recording events to create this memoir, published in 1992, so that this tragedy would be remembered. His tales of wartime misery relate to the squalid conditions of POW life and his later Polish army service, which took him to Iran, Iraq, Palestine, and the Monte Cassino campaign in Italy. The unique aspect of Sloes's book is that it provides a Jewish perspective from inside the Polish officer corps. As he points out, there were at least 1,000 Jews among the Polish officers, including the chief rabbi of the Polish army. This book is a reproduction of the documents and materials from the Soviet archives turned over to Poland on October 14, 1992 by Russian President Boris Yeltsin. This includes the document of March 5, 1940, written by Beria and signed by Stalin, ordering the murder of Polish officers at the three camps and Poles who were held in prisons in Soviet-occupied eastern Poland. Originally published in the Soviet Union in January 1991 as The Labyrinth of Katyn, this book, The Murderers of Katyn by Vladimir Abarinov, was published in 1993 and represents the first comprehensive attempt by a Soviet journalist to reveal the lies generated by the Soviet propaganda machine in relation to Katyn. Taking advantage of glasnost, Abarinov cites many Soviet documents which had never before been published, and draws on other sources to point out the real murderers of Katyn, namely the NKVD acting on Stalin's orders. This book represents the labors of a Soviet journalist who felt a moral obligation to set the record straight. George Sandford is a former professor of politics at the University of Bristol, England. He specializes in Polish and English European studies. George Sandford has published several books and numerous articles and book chapters. Although he has an English name, in this book, Katyn and the Soviet Massacre of 1940, Truth, Justice, and Memory, he refers to his father as a, quote, Pole of Second World War vintage, unquote. Sandford's book is based on authoritative Soviet documentation and provides a dispassionate and comprehensive account of the planning and implementation of the whole NKVD Katyn operation. Sandford shows how the truth about the 1940 massacre was sacrificed to realpolitik considerations of maintaining Allied unity and defeating the Nazis. He examines in detail how the British Foreign Office repeatedly reconfirmed its, quote, open verdict line, unquote, from 1943 until Gorbachev's admission of Soviet guilt in 1990. Katyn, Crime Without Punishment, edited by Anna Tchinchela, Natalia Lebedeva, and Wojciech Matersky, published in 2007. Three leading historians of the NKVD massacres of Polish prisoners of war at Katyn present 122 documents selected from the published Russian and Polish volumes co-edited by Natalia Lebedeva and Wojciech Matersky. The documents, with introductions and notes by Anna Tchinchela, detail the Soviet killings, the elaborate cover-up, the admission of the truth, and the Katyn question in Soviet-Russian-Polish relations up to the present. Class Cleansing, The Massacre at Katyn by Viktor Zaslavsky, 2008. Viktor Zaslavsky was born in Leningrad in 1937 and forced to emigrate from the Soviet Union in 1974. He became a Canadian citizen. He was a professor of political sociology and has taught at the University of Leningrad and a number of universities in Canada, the US, and Italy. His major work prior to his death in 2009 was Class Cleansing, The Massacre at Katyn, which received the Anna Arendt Prize for Political Thought from the Heinrich Boel Foundation. He sees the Catton Massacre as not merely the elimination of potential future Polish resistance, nor just the destruction of incorrigibly religious and anti-communist men, but primarily an act of classicide or class cleansing. Alan Paul is an American who earned his master's degree in international public policy from Johns Hopkins University. He was a journalist, political speechwriter, and author. He became interested in the Catton Massacre while studying at university. Although he is not Polish, Alan Paul developed a deep affection for Poland and the Poles. When his book, Katyn, Stalin's Massacre and the Triumph of Truth, was first published in 1991, it was widely acclaimed. The book has gone through several editions with updates from Russian archives. A new edition, published in 2006 by Poland's largest publisher, became an instant bestseller. In 2009, the President of Poland recognized his book, Katyn, by awarding the Commander's Cross of the Order of Merit. Eugenia Maresh was born into a Polish military family and deported to Siberia in 1940. She was educated in England, where she settled in 1947. She wrote a number of books about the history of World War II. This book, Katyn, 1940, The Documentary Evidence of the West's Betrayal, was published in 2010. It draws on intelligence reports, previously unpublished documents, witness statements, memoranda, briefing papers of diplomats and civil servants of various echelons who dealt with the Catton Massacre up to the present day in order to expose the problematic nature of the British and American attitudes towards the massacre. Katyn, State-Sponsored Extermination. This book was edited by M.B. Zonert and published in 2012. It is a relatively thin book, but a collection of very interesting essays. Mark Kramer, what is distinctive about Katyn, the massacres in context? Tadeusz Jazudowicz, Radosław Forndowski, Moscow Secrecy and the Katyn Crime. Karol Karski, The Katyn Crime under Nuremberg Principles. Aurelia Puczynski, Wall of Secrecy, Investigation of Katyn. Witold Wasilewski, Katyn Documents in the Russian Archives, 2012 State of Disclosure. Maria Sonert-Binienda, Katyn Families Struggle for Justice. Krystyna Piorkowska was born in Toronto. Her parents were survivors of the deportations from eastern Poland who met while they served in the Anders Army. Piorkowska was raised in New York State and has degrees from City College of New York and Columbia University. She has many publications to her name. Between 2006 and 2012, she worked as a researcher and translator for the Polish Army Museum in Warsaw, which published this book, English-Speaking Witnesses to Katyn, Recent Research, in 2012. This work is the first study of the 5 Allied English-speaking POWs brought, among others, by the Germans to view the crime scene of Katyn in 1943, and it chronicles their attempts to disseminate the truth about the massacre. You see the book is in Polish as well. It's in both languages. In this famous picture of POWs, the English-speaking POWs, looking at some exhibits at Katyn, there is one civilian here. His name is Frank Strubant, and he was from the Channel Island of Guernsey. The Germans occupied the Channel Islands in the summer of 1940. In September 1942, after the British arrested German citizens residing in Persia, Hitler gave orders, as a reciprocating action, that certain categories of British civilians residing in the Channel Islands should be deported. Frank Strubant was among those who were caught up in this deportation. He was taken to one of the camps for civilians in Bavaria. Due in part to his organizational abilities and skill at conducting matters with camp authorities, he was elected camp senior. He was taken by the Germans to Katyn in 1943 and subsequently wrote his memoirs, One Man's War, in 1967. Several chapters addressed the experience of going to Katyn and seeing the mass graves. In his book, Strubant makes it clear that he was aware that if he were to actively participate in Nazi propaganda, his behavior may be perceived as collaboration with the enemy and result in criminal charges of treason after the war. And you see here, chapter on macabre assignment, propaganda in Smolensk, the forest of Katyn, and the return journey, all having to do with his experience of going to the Katyn forest. Children of the Catton Massacre, Accounts of Life After the 1940 Soviet Murder of Polish POWs, by Teresa Kaczorowska, originally published in Polish in 2003, English in 2006. Teresa Kaczorowska was a journalist and the president of the Polish Writers Association. This book is based on personal interviews and records of the stories of 18 men and women, 16 of whom lost their fathers in the Catton Massacre. The author traveled extensively to conduct the interviews and record their thoughts, feelings, and memories of hardship during and after the war. One of the interviewees is the son of Stanisław Swianiewicz, who translated his father's book into English in 2002, In the Shadows of Katyn, which was previously mentioned. I would like to dedicate this video to the memory of all the victims of the Catton Massacre, including my grandfather, Stanisław Kawczak, a lawyer, writer, and captain in the Polish army. Captured by the Soviets in 1939 and held at Starobjesk, he was murdered with his fellow officers by the Soviet NKVD in Kharkov in 1940. May he and his colleagues rest in peace.